Right, well, good morning, everyone, again. If I could just ask for a bit of housekeeping in terms of muting your microphones, please, just to make sure that everyone's able to hear the session. We'll also, as you might have just gathered, we're recording the session, so if you wish, you may wish to turn your camera off, unless you'd like your face appearing in the recording, which of course you're welcome to do that. It's going to be a 90-minute session, broken down into 3 parts. So the first part will be looking at what is a local nature recovery strategy, and I know for a few this may be sort of something that you're already very much familiar with, but I want to make sure that everyone understands the purposes of the strategy before we move into part 2, which is looking at what the strategy actually is, what the strategy is proposing for recovery of nature in the county. If we have time, if I've managed not to chat on too much in the first 2 sessions, we'll have a very short 5-minute break at that point, just for everyone to recharge their cups of teas and coffees or glasses of water. And then we'll come back for the final session, which will be how the strategy, as far as we understand it, can be used to inform nature recovery. And I'll also provide a little overview of the online mapping platform and how you can use that for those purposes. After each of those parts, each of those sections this morning, we will have a Q&A. Please use the Slido to log your questions, and that was circulated this morning. We won't be monitoring the chat in the Teams. And just to let you know, we will circulate a copy of the presentation and the recording, so no need to scribble away, and no need to sort of try and capture everything. If I can just remind people to put their microphones on mute, please, so that we're not interrupted by background noise, that would be much appreciated. Fabulous. Right, with all of that, I will crack on as we've some content to cover this morning. So first of all, a sort of a scene setter as to why we want to, why we need to recover nature. So the latest State of Nature report showed quite starkly why it is that we need to do something and why we need to act very fast. It showed that UK species abundance had declined on average by 19%. And in addition, 1 in 6 species were threatened with extinction. And in the period in which these records have been taken, we've already lost 151 species. So, you know, it really is quite a serious state in terms of our nature. And then, as well as the loss of species, the strategy, the report rather found that only 1 in 7 of the UK's important habitats for wildlife were actually found to be in good condition. So when you consider that point, it's not surprising that we are seeing such a decline on the species that rely on these habitats themselves. And sadly, this means that the UK is currently classified as one of the world's most nature depleted countries. And, you know, it's perhaps not surprising when you see these statistics from the 2023 State of Nature report. And unfortunately, that national picture is very much reflected at the local level in our county. So our State of Nature report in 22 showed that 10% of our assessed species are threatened with extinction. And over 30% of our triple SIs are not in favourable condition. And when you consider that within Kent, in fact, nationally, you know, these areas in the county are home to our most rare and endangered species and should represent our best wildlife and geological sites, the fact that nearly 1/3 of them are not being managed to a state to bring them into good condition is really concerning. And that is as a result of the fact that there is a decline in the area of land under conservation management. Also, I'm sure many of you are aware, it's in the press a lot, the majority of our rivers and lakes and coastal waters are not meeting good ecological status. And all of these issues are compounded by the fact we have a growing population. And that means that concerns such as habitat fragmentation and loss, increasing pollution levels, all these sorts of pressures that come from a growing population, they're unlikely to change without significant intervention. And also, action to address this desperate picture for nature is not just needed for nature's sake alone, but also for all the services we get from nature. Nature provides us with things such as food and drink, water supply, and materials for building. It helps regulate our environment by giving us clean air, storing carbon, and helping to reduce pollution. It also supports us through healthy soils and nutrient cycling. And it also provides a wealth of cultural values as well, not only helping our physical health and our mental well-being, but also providing opportunities for tourism and recreation. And across all of these services, there is also an economic factor. And so, you know, even if we weren't going to address nature for its own sake, we have to, for our own survival, make sure that we do something to tackle the decline of nature. So in response to this picture, in 2022, the government published legally binding targets to protect our environment, to clean up our air and our rivers, and to boost nature. And these legally binding commitments pledge to end the decline of nature and for nature to recover. And the government recognised that any nature recovery would need targeted, coordinated and collaborative action at the local level. And so used the 2021 Environment Act to set in place a requirement for the development of local nature recovery strategies. So I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before, but just to make sure we all understand exactly what a nature recovery strategy is. As I said, it comes as a result of the 2021 Environment Act. There will be 48 of these across England with no gaps or overlaps. So each strategy acting as a piece of jigsaw that connects across the landscape and makes sure that every element of England is covered. To ensure that there is that join up and that there is that sort of connectivity and consistency across England in terms of these strategies, they are led by regulations and statutory guidance, and we've all been provided with a grant by DEFRA to develop these to our very best abilities. And they're working at a landscape scale, so making sure that sort of looking at nature recovery at a landscape strategic scale, and in most cases this was sort of done on the boundaries of counties. Within Kent and Medway, KCC, Kent County Council, were appointed the responsible authority, and each of the strategies have a locally appointed responsible authority. And importantly, these are strategies to be collaboratively developed. These were strategies that, unlike other strategies where previously the appointed authority might disappear for 12 months with the input of some partners and interested parties, and then the first time the majority of stakeholders would see the strategy would be at this stage at public consultation. There was a real drive in the regulations to ensure that stakeholders were very much involved right from the very start of the strategy's development. And all of this together works to agree the local priorities and the associated actions for nature recovery. And collectively, all these local actions and these local priorities will work together to deliver a nature recovery network for England that aims to end the decline of nature and also supports its recovery. So in Kent and Medway, we set out to agree a set of priorities for nature recovery, and alongside those identify measures that would deliver that nature recovery, to agree a shared vision for nature recovery and also the use of nature-based solutions within the county, to consequently develop a framework for joined up action. And because the strategy would be developed with those that would be instrumental in its delivery, it would enable an ambitious but also realistic and deliverable plan. And importantly, many of what we're trying to do, or much of what we're trying to do, is linked to supporting mechanisms and finance. So there's also that genuine delivery mechanism that we hope will enable this strategy to actually be delivered and see the outcomes that we have set out that we want to see for nature in Kent and Medway. And finally, what we would be developing is a spatially framed strategy for nature. So not only setting out what we want to see and how we would like to see that delivered, but also focusing action to where it's most needed and where it will deliver the greatest benefits, so the where as well. The strategy has some elements that, like I said, that enable its delivery. But to just be clear what the strategy will and won't do. So whilst we will be identifying areas where action is likely to provide the greatest gains, the boundaries drawn by the strategy are not localized, detailed or definitive. So they are indicative of where action will provide that gain that we need to see. The strategies also identify potential measures that could be taken to support the nature recovery. So they're not dictating actions or instructing their implementation. And likewise, there's no intention that any of this will force landowners and managers to make any changes to the way they use and manage the land or they undertake their operations. But because the strategy will be linked to government funding and government grants and also other external funding sources and investment, it's hoped that the action that has been proposed will be incentivised to landowners and land managers to pick them up and help us deliver them. The strategy also does not offer any formal protection, nor does it prevent development from happening, but it will have a role in informing future local plans, and it will also have a role in informing development management, that is planning applications in relation to biodiversity net gain. And although we come to publish it, hopefully in the summer of this year, it doesn't stop there. Obviously, the real work really begins when we start looking at delivery. But also the strategy will need to be reviewed, revised and republished on a regular cycle as instructed by the Secretary of State, and that will happen every 3 to 10 years. So essentially what we're looking at is a strategy that will direct action investment to our greatest areas of greatest need and areas of greatest benefit, and it will direct the losses and impacts away from our most valuable assets. So really provide a really useful tool to inform land use and land management. In developing the strategy, there were 8 principles that we considered and applied all the way throughout to ensure that this delivered a strategy that was fit for purpose and really served what our nature needs within the county. So first of all, this was ensuring that we constantly considered the landscape character, the catchment functions and the ecosystem links across the county to make sure that what we did result with was a strategy that preserved, retained and enhanced those functional elements of the natural environment within the county. We wanted to make sure that we focused on addressing the most significant impacts arising from pressures and challenges facing nature. So making sure that we were directing efforts and actions and investment to where these impacts were having the most effect and most negative impact on our nature. And also targeting efforts to our most significant important habitats. And those were not just habitats where we might be a particular stronghold for them nationally, but also where there may be habitats that we have very limited resources of. And so we want to make sure that they are managed and as looked after as well as possible. And consequently, this meant that we would concentrate on habitats that were threatened within the county. So whether that was threatened in extent, or whether that was threatened in terms of quality or were at risk from climate change. Our 5th principle was making sure that we gave consideration to the needs of our threatened species and identifying bespoke interventions needed for those, but also making sure that in all the work that we're undertaking, that species remain at the heart of that, and species remain at the heart of the potential measures that we put in place to address our nature recovery priorities. Our 6th principle was to ensure that we also were supporting local and national priorities and ambitions for nature, and not just nature, but also where possible to support ambitions that related to green and blue infrastructure and also the wider environment. And consequently, we also wanted to identify the actions and delivery mechanisms needed to achieve the priorities for the county's nature, but also targeting those, as I said, to the areas that were most in need and would deliver the most benefits. And we'll keep coming back to that statement of where it's most needed and where it will deliver the most benefits, because that is the purpose of the LNRS, to really focus attention and to make the most of the resources that we have at our disposal. And finally, the last principle was to ensure that we maximise opportunities for delivering nature-based solutions. So one of the reasons for that is not just because it sort of makes sense that you get more return for your investment if it's also enhancing the ecosystem services that that particular environmental feature provides, but also by doing so, we might open up other opportunities for investment and funding by delivering a nature-based solution to a particular issue, but within that also providing some mechanism and some support of nature recovery alongside that. And then an overarching principle of the strategy's development was very much this participatory development. We wanted to make sure that stakeholders were involved right from the outset so that we would ensure that the strategy would be based on the most up-to-date data and evidence, that it was developed with the input of the many experts that we have within the county and also experts that work within the county. So they might not reside here, but we're very fortunate to have a lot of experts input into work all across the county. That our strategy would be informed by those with local knowledge and importantly practical experience. So really making sure that anything that we set out in the strategy was appropriate and was deliverable. And also by having this open and engaged process, it would ensure that the whole strategy's development was completely transparent. And we were blown away by the response to get involved, with over 1,000 people engaged across the past year. And actually, this is a modest estimate, as it's only based on the events that we had attendance numbers for, and bearing in mind all the other opportunities that we were offered to get involved and to take our strategy out to various stakeholders. We think we're probably looking at double that. So we really feel that this has been properly had a lot of participation from relevant stakeholders, and those stakeholders are across the board. So they're not just your sort of expected people such as conservation, non-governmental organisations, your local government, but people from across many different sectors. And as a result, the 678 workshops attendees that we had for the 20 workshops that we had resulted in just under 300 different organisations, bodies, businesses and affiliations attending. In addition to this, we also had steer and guidance from a board and delivery group. We had a group specifically for supporting authorities, so that being Natural England and our county's planning authorities, to make sure that what we were developing would work alongside local planning. We very gratefully received dedicated advisors from Natural England, Environment Agency and Forestry Commission, and really we really were very grateful of all the input from our technical advisory groups who gave up their time for free and provided some amazing expert input in terms of data, evidence and mapping, species recovery, land management and land use, freshwater, coastal and communications. So we really have been very fortunate the amount of input we've had. And owing to this exceptional amount of input, whenever I use the word we in terms of what the strategy is proposing and what the strategy is setting out, I really do mean the county rather than we, Kent County Council. We are purely responsible authority for the development of this strategy. It is a strategy that essentially is owned by the county and is not a county council strategic document, although I hope that the authority will lead the way by adopting it. And just to say that the strategy is utterly indebted to the extensive contributions to everyone that contributed. And I know we've got many people on the call today who gave us your time or expertise and support throughout the process. So I will pause there now just to see if there are any questions in respect of what the local nature strategy is setting out to do and the sort of basic development process that we had. Please use the Slido to pop your questions in. Chris, is there anything in the Slido at the moment?
Well, it's not a question, it's a link to the Times from Andy Bishop. I can't open it actually, but it says Labour strips environmental groups of powers to delay house building. So there's nice, I don't know, that's the question.
I think no, it was just something that I saw on social media this morning. It was just flagged in my mind as soon as we were talking about implementing the plan and I suppose to some extent the element of this which is currently non-binding, which obviously I understand the reasons why that's going to be the case, but ultimately a lot of these stuff does need to be underpinned by legislation, and any attempts by government to weaken the legislation and weaken those protections and weaken those regulations is inevitably going to make our job around this harder, particularly with the pressures around, affordable homes and all the rest of it. So we know these pressures are going to bash directly into each other on many fronts. And I was just kind of highlighting that. Yeah, well, that matter really, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Andy. And interestingly, so we had a presentation for planning authority officers on Monday, and the query over how does devolution and the planning reforms affect this, and the provisions that are currently made for the local nature recovery strategy within planning. How does, all these different changes and a new government with different drives and different aspirations, how does it affect the local nature recovery strategy? We don't know is a very unhelpful but honest answer. We don't know how these changes are going to affect it, other than the fact that the requirement for the local nature recovery strategy to be considered in the preparation of new plans is within legislation, and so one would hope that would still be upheld and that won't be watered down. But we are still waiting on guidance from MHCLG and DEFRA as to specifically what the role of local nature recovery strategies, and importantly what the weight of local nature recovery strategies will hold within the preparation of new or revised local plans. And of course, if we do end up going down the devolved route, then there's going to be a big rush in terms of potentially, how local plans are managed, depending on how the county is sort of divided up. So there's lots of unknowns at the moment, I agree, and it does feel concerning at times when you see the drive for house building, and the understandable drive for house building, but the fact that we still seem to be in this sort of misunderstanding that it's the natural environment that holds up development as opposed to other matters. So yeah, thank you for raising that. Interestingly, I think it's something that's going to come up throughout a lot of these briefings. Any other questions or comments, Chris, from people?
No.
Lovely. Okay. On that basis, then I will move on to the next part of the presentation, which is really looking at what the strategy that has been prepared is setting out. So the strategy itself is divided into 2 documents plus the online mapping tool. And the first section, part 1, sets the context and essentially provides a justification for the priorities and action the strategy proposes, but on the basis that I think probably most of us know what Kent's landscape looks like, why our nature is considered so special, and why we need to actually take some action to address the pressures, threats and challenges. I'm not going to dwell on that section today, and instead I'm going to focus on part 2, which is the real nuts and bolts of the strategy and what it is that we're proposing for nature recovery in the county. But if there is anything that you have any questions about in respect of part 1, please feel free to pop them in Slido, or as you read the strategy, if there's any questions on that, just drop us a line to the project. So part 2 of the strategy presents essentially the required elements of a local nature recovery strategy. So that is the principles and vision that underpin everything that we're trying to achieve for nature recovery, the priorities that our stakeholders told us they wanted to see, the outcomes that they wanted to see for the county's nature, the potential measures that are associated with these priorities, and then the mapping of those potential measures to deliver the best benefits and the widest gains. Then also there's the other three mapped elements of the strategy, which is the areas of particular importance for biodiversity, the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, and the local habitat map. And so in this session, I'm going to take you through each one of these elements in turn, first starting with the principles and vision. So you will probably be very familiar with the first four of these principles because they are very much used, the Lawton principles, but we've added in the addition of maximising opportunities for nature recovery to also deliver nature-based solutions, and recognising that integral role that landowners and managers and farmers have in supporting nature recovery. So what we're basically looking for is, under the principle of better, to improve the quality of our existing habitats and ensure they're in a healthy and functioning state, and looking after better what we already have as well. To increase the size of our most valuable and important habitat sites, and then to move on to establish new nature-rich sites that not only provide that space for nature, but also provide the connectivity that we need between our existing core sites. And then finally, in line with the Lawton principles, is to make sure that where we have got these good quality habitat sites, that those connections are enhanced, and new sites and existing sites are very much joined up. So we have that sort of open landscape that allows species movement and also enables our nature to be more resilient and adaptable as the climate changes. And then alongside that, we want to work with nature and use natural processes to tackle some of the socio-economic challenges our county faces, such as flood risk, water provision, responding to many other challenges that a changing climate has, such as increased temperature. And then also, as I said, really understanding and recognising the role of private landowners, managers and farmers to work with us to deliver a better, more coherent and resilient wildlife network, as many of our landowners and farmers already do, but really building on that and putting them at the heart of the work we're trying to do. So when we started reviewing the outcomes that our stakeholders told us they wanted to see for nature, there were very clear emerging high-level ambitions that centred around broad habitat groupings. So we use those to develop our 10 ambitions that together make up the local nature recovery strategy vision. And under each of these sits more specific priorities, and many which of these priorities drill down to really specific habitat types. So these ambitions focus on increasing the functional connectivity of high quality habitats, increasing the use of nature-based solutions, as I said, land management and land use, increasingly delivering nature recovery gains, putting species at the heart of habitat management, restoration, extension and creation, restoring and extending and connecting our species-rich grassland, safeguarding our successional habitats from loss and damage, bringing woodland trees and hedgerows under active management and increasing cover and connectivity, ensuring our freshwater habitats are clean, sufficient and healthy, and that associated catchment functions are restored, providing for nature in urban environments, and finally securing high functioning, natural and connected coastal habitats. And just as an aside, we appreciate that our ambitions and the vision, there's a lot of words in it which don't always mean something to someone. So what we sort of did to help support the appreciation of what these words really mean was to commission some artwork which actually probably illustrate our ambitions so much better than we could ever write, and certainly the text can. So just to let you know that this artwork will be joining us on the consultation roadshow as we travel around the county, and if you haven't already been to see it, I really would encourage you to, because it's quite beautiful and inspiring too, and thought-provoking as well, I would say. So then, sitting under those 10 ambitions are these more detailed priorities which outline the outcome we want to see for nature recovery in Kent and Medway. And in addition to these priorities, we also have identified priority species that the action should be focused on. The priorities were developed with stakeholders through a series of workshops which helped us to focus on outcomes that tackle the country's most notable pressures and challenges, and supported delivery of local and national ambition against our most significant, important or at-risk habitats. We have 52 priorities in the strategy, so I'm not going to take you through all 52 today, but these are just some examples of the priorities that we've identified under the ambitions of connectivity, nature-based solutions, land management, species-rich grasslands and successional habitats. And then under the ambitions of ancient woodlands, chalk streams, urban and coastal. And I appreciate you won't have had the chance to read all of those, but as I said, I will circulate this, the presentation, and also you have the strategy itself to read all of those in more detail. We also, as I said, identified a number of priority species. So following guidelines from Natural England, we identified within the county that we had a long list of just over 1,500 rare, threatened and significant species within the county. And from this, we had to select our priority species, which was a massively tall order to try and whittle that number of species down to a manageable sum. So under the guidance of the brilliant Species Recovery Technical Advisory Group, of which we had over 30 species specialists from the county and outside helping us to identify these, we identified 141 species, which represents all taxas, and we've selected those not only based on the need and urgency, but also in consideration of whether action for them as a species could also support the recovery of other species that were associated with the same habitat assemblage. So we hope that whilst it's whittled down to 141, it actually will provide benefit to more than just those 141 species. And for each of those 141 species, potential measures to support their recovery are identified. And whilst we do hope that those actions will have a wider benefit, we've also, to address the 1,300 odd species not included in the priority shortlist, we also have a priority that ensures consideration is given to all of our threatened and vulnerable species within the county whenever any action that is delivering on the strategy is designed. And then sitting under each of these 52 priorities are a number of potential measures. So potential measures essentially are the proposed action that will deliver the priority. And as I said, we go on then to target it to where it will deliver the greatest gains and benefits. So within the strategy, every priority has its associated potential measures listed, and against these denote which of the strategy principles they relate to, which the principal strategies they deliver. So this is an example here of how it is presented in the strategy. Down the left-hand side, you have the priority itself. So in this case, we're looking at coastal and floodplain grazing marsh. And we have a potential measure here that is associated with better, so improving the management of what we have. We have a potential measure that relates to more, so that is restoring, extending and creating the grazing marsh. And finally, we also have a potential measure that delivers against the principle of connectivity, so reconnecting rivers with the floodplain. Also presented within the potential measures are supporting measures. So we don't have any shown here, but on some of our priorities, there are supporting measures identified that we have been told by our stakeholders are needed to support delivery of this priority. So in terms of the scope of the strategy, these supportive measures sit outside of the scope, but we felt it was really important to include them within the strategy to set the context of, whilst this action is needed, there also are some mechanisms that sit underneath that are required if it really is to be successful. So that's things like creating networks where landowners delivering similar actions can sort of share approaches, can give peer-to-peer learning, give support, providing advice and guidance to various sectors, etc. Similarly to that sort of information that's or those supportive measures that sit outside the scope of the strategy are also additional information needs. And again, we wanted to make sure we included those within the context of the potential measure, so that we have a record of what further information is needed to support this, the delivery of this priority. And this is particularly important in terms of when we're coming to review and revise and update. So we need to make sure that this information, additional information we need, we have that for the next time we come to update the strategy, so that we can even better target and understand where these potential measures and where these priorities should be delivered. And finally, also on the same page, we present all of the priority species that are related to that particular habitat or will be served by that particular priority. In the measures table, you will see that there are reference numbers sitting alongside the potential measures. So these reference numbers allow you to find those potential measures on the online map, and I'll come to that in due course. So in some cases you will see potential measures listed without a reference number, and those are the potential measures that we've been unable to map. So we then, when we've got those potential measures, so the next presentation within the strategy is mapping those measures. So targeting to not only where they will deliver the best gains and widest benefits, but where there may be also opportunities to deliver against or deliver nature-based solutions to local issues in that area. More detail is provided in the strategy and appendices as to how we develop the mapping, but just briefly, I thought it would be useful to give an overview. So first of all, we took each measure and we looked at what data and evidence there was available to inform, define, and map each of those potential measures. And that allowed us to determine not only whether the measure could be mapped, but whether there was sufficient information to enable us to really drill down to where that action should be best targeted, to where it was most needed, or where action would be most beneficial. And it was a case that not all measures could be mapped to this degree because of insufficient data or knowledge, or the appropriate mapping approach was just too costly or time consuming. The result of this was this initial approach of only mapping those measures that could be sufficiently refined to devise the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, so our areas of opportunity. That meant that some areas of the county appeared from the mapping to have no potential or importance for nature recovery, and obviously that was not the case, and instead represented areas where measures largely related to improving management, and therefore there was little on which to prioritise one area over another. Or it was just simply the case, as I said, that available data wasn't sufficient to enable the required refinement. But when we looked at these maps with stakeholders, they felt that this was really problematic and misrepresented the actual value of these areas to nature recovery. So consequently, we decided to take the approach where we would map every potential measure that we could, even if that was only to the extent of basing the opportunity on the existing habitat type or the potential for that habitat type. So consequently, we have a lot of potential measures mapping that underpins the priorities. We took all of these maps out to our stakeholders and partners. We had 5 workshops, we had some evening sessions with landowners and farmers, and we also had dedicated sessions with all of our local planning authorities and our 2 national landscapes teams to really drill down into these maps and ensure that they were was accurate and refined as possible, and essentially ground truthing the desk-based mapping work that had been undertaken by the Wildlife Trust. So we then basically looked to further refine those potential measures where we could by addressing opportunities for wider environmental challenges by nature-based solutions, but then looking at other benefits such as health and access. So for instance, where we had a measure that related to increase in area and extent, and that increase in area and extent was not conflicting with also allowing increased access, then we would look to where we might create such areas where we knew there were either health needs or access needs in that particular area. So again, that allowed us to focus it down to where it would serve the best wider value to society. And all of our potential measures mapping is available online, and I will cover this in more detail in the final session. But just to give you an example, so within the strategy document itself, only grouped measures per priority are presented. So for instance, the example here shows all of the coastal and floodplain grazing marsh potential measures mapped. And so these are all the opportunity areas for recovering and restoring coastal and floodplain grazing marsh within the county. But of more use, arguably, is the individual measures mapping, and they're available via the online mapping tool. So in this case, still looking at grazing marsh, but delving down into the potential measure of restoring, extending and creating it, where it offers gains for our most important grazing marsh flora and fauna. So this allows us to present the strategy, the strategy's potential measure, but also by having it online, you can then scrutinise it at a more localised level by scanning in and out, and I will demonstrate that in the final session. So then we come to our three other formal maps of the strategy, the first being areas of particular importance for biodiversity, which we refer to as our APIB. So this essentially is the mapped national conservation sites, local sites and irreplaceable habitat, and the map looks as such. And this was mapped to strict regulations, so we were only allowed to include nationally designated sites, our local wildlife sites, our local nature reserves and irreplaceable habitats as defined by biodiversity net gain. So those habitats that are present in Kent include ancient woodland, ancient trees, coastal sand dunes, spartina swards and lowland fens. And you can see there that we have quite a lot of areas of the county already considered of particular importance for biodiversity. The second map is the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, and these essentially are the opportunity and target areas mapped. So again, how we approached the mapping of this is included in the strategy, but as a brief overview, first of all, we took a foundation for mapping our areas that could become of importance for biodiversity by looking at our potential measures. And so, like I said, we have now mapped all the measures we could, but any measures that were insufficiently refined were excluded. And in most cases, this related to measures that weren't focused on restoration, creation or connection principles. Those maps were then refined further by really looking at the local environmental challenges that could be addressed by the nature-based solutions that those habitats provided and other wider benefits, like I said, such as health and access. And then once we had done that refinement further, we then looked at how we could link all of those sites in a meaningful way. And so what we did was we then focused to look at connectivity modelling to refine that map further. And that connectivity modelling placed priority on areas of low species flow, focused on bottlenecks to connectivity, and also looked at how we could buffer and link the existing areas of particular importance. So those areas that are already theoretically under some form of protection or management. And the rationale for this final element of creating the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity is that a more joined up, connected landscape was the ultimate ambition of the strategy. If the principles of the strategy, the bigger, better, better, bigger, more joined up, if those principles were considered a hierarchy that ultimately went to ensuring that our landscape was joined up. So, as I said, not all potential measures could be used to inform this areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, and I think this image demonstrates why. So, this is a map that shows all of our potential measures mapped. And as you can see, it's very untargeted and unfocused, with pretty much the whole of the county under some level of potential measure and action. And what that shows us is what we already know, that everywhere has the potential to be an important area for nature, but the strategy requirements, the regulations require us to be more focused in where we're suggesting those measures and those actions should be taken. And hence that's why we took the approach we did and focused down as required. And the resulting map is the one shown here, which is about 38% coverage for the county. And then the final map is the local habitat map, and that essentially is the areas of particular importance for biodiversity and the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity combined. And the purpose of this is, by combining these, we have a map that indicates our areas of strategic significance. So I will outline how the strategy and its maps are used to inform nature recovery in the final session, and have a look at those, the functioning of the online mapping tool to support that. But I'll just pause now for some questions in respect of the sort of nuts and bolts of the strategy in terms of our ambitions, priorities, measures, and that sort of high level mapping that's been presented. Chris?
Well, we haven't got anything on Slido or the chat at the moment.
I'll just give people a few minutes in case they wish to pop anything in. So while we're waiting, in case people are wanting to pop questions in.
Got one.
You have, brilliant. Fire away, Chris.
Okay. How likely is it that mapped areas will change through the consultation?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, that is the purpose of the consultation, is that people have the ability to comment and challenge what we have presented. The mapping is very much based on what we consider a robust approach to mapping these areas. And so we would hope that, largely speaking, they are correct and they are appropriate. But honestly, it's impossible to say at this stage, so early on, what sort of feedback we might expect in relation to the maps. The one thing I will say is that the benefit of having had such great participation from stakeholders and people who know the land all the way through the process is that we can have a pretty reasonable degree of confidence that at the very least our approach to the mapping is right, and that generally on a landscape strategic scale the mapping is right. There will, I am sure, be local sort of discrepancies as to where things have been mapped, and there may be some edits that need to be made. I will say that also that where there are any sort of challenges or additions or deletions that are suggested to the mapping, those will need to be backed with good reason and good justification, as opposed to sort of an individual wanting to see a bit of land either in or out for their own personal reasons. There has to be a reason for it to be in or out that sits alongside the delivery of the potential measures and the delivery of the priority and ultimately the 10 principles of the strategy. But yeah, it will be interesting to see what sort of feedback we get. Chris?
Another question from Andy, which is, so now the ASIP has been determined, will those areas included within it be offered tangible incentives to participate? How will the incentives be promoted?
Well, that's a question really that needs to go back to DEFRA, Andy, I'm afraid, because we don't know yet. Our understanding is that government grants and funding, such as elms and other things like potentially tree establishment grants and funding and other bits and pieces, will incentivize delivery of the local nature recovery strategy. But exactly how that how that is done, I'm afraid we cannot answer that. We're purely providing the guidance as to where that should happen, as opposed to it's not down for us to say how that delivery is then incentivized by others in terms of their funding and guidance. So yeah, that's a pretty unhelpful response, but is very much one for DEFRA. I will touch on this a bit in terms of incentivization when I go through in the final session how it will be informed. So that might answer some of your questions, but certainly the real mechanics and logistics of how this all works is yet to be explained, or detailed rather.
We have a boring practical question.
Oh, has someone else described it? Is that Chris, or is that
Yeah,
your
not
take
me.
on it?
Sorry, I wouldn't be that rude. It says, will organisations with ArcGIS or similar be able to access the live layers for our own internal mapping purposes once agreed?
Yes, absolutely. So we have to provide all of the mapping has to be provided as open source so that people can use it. I will explain later in terms of what the current online mapping tool is and its limitations, but our intention is to develop a online mapping tool that really relates to how these maps will be used to incentivize action and will be used to inform planning and all those sorts of things. So as well as providing it as open source, you should also be able to access it and view it quite easily online with the published strategy. So yeah, absolutely. The maps are so integral to the strategy, they have to be made available for people to interrogate.
And we've got one here. How did developers industry feel about the LNRS? What is the feedback so far?
So we haven't had our online briefing with developers yet, but actually we have had conversations and meetings with them during the course of the strategy's development. The last one was in the summer when we had got to the point of well, late summer rather, we'd got to the point of the potential measures having been identified and some initial mapping being done. And they actually were very largely supportive of it. I think many developers are keen to have some answers to some of the questions that are still outstanding in regards to biodiversity net gain, which is what the LNRS helps to provide. They are keen to deliver or be part of the delivery framework for the strategy within their own developments, whether that's on site or then also delivery off site through mitigation and their biodiversity net gain obligations. How they might feel about some of the mapping when they look at it at a very detailed level, we're yet to hear. But I think I don't think there certainly shouldn't be any massive sort of hairs running as a result of it, just simply because, as I'll come to shortly, the areas of local significance, but particularly the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, that second map of opportunity, does not preclude development, does not state that things will not happen in those areas. So there shouldn't be anything in the strategy that makes them particularly fearful, because it shouldn't stop their operations at all, and shouldn't stop. So that doesn't just apply to developers, it applies to anyone with land within the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity.
We've got a question in the chat from Adriana, which is that considering that international frameworks for biodiversity recognise the importance of human social dimensions in conservation, it seems like a missed opportunity not including these aspects in the consultation. The participatory process itself is a positive initiative, but social feasibility considerations will be necessary for the implementation of measures.
Yes, so the reason that they're not particularly focused on within the strategy is simply because they sit outside the scope of the legal framework of or the requirements of the local nature recovery strategy, and we were required to just focus on actions that looked at habitats and actions that looked at species. So we couldn't actually include actions that relate to those sort of societal things that you're referring to there. I will say, though, that within the strategy, those supporting mechanisms, which I referred to, so those that sit outside of the scope of the strategy, some of those do include some of the things that we would need to engender and encourage within society. And there is an observed gap that now sits as a result of the local nature recovery strategy will supersede the existing Kent biodiversity strategy, which a quarter of that focused on that link between humans and nature. And the Nature Partnership will be doing some work to look at how that gap can be filled to make sure that those opportunities, well, not just opportunities, but those priorities are not missed. So it's a good point, well made, Adriana, and something that is being looked at, because we want to make sure that that's not forgotten. So this final session is about how we envisage, as we understand it, the local nature recovery strategy will inform nature recovery in a county, and consequently how you would use the maps, and in particular the mapping tool, to help you work through what the strategy presents. So as I sort of alluded to in the previous Q&A, the mapping tool that we have currently has been created for the purposes of the consultation. So the intention is to develop something with more functionality once we have a clearer steer on the mapper's role in nature recovery action and also local planning. And in doing so, we can ensure that it's truly fit for purpose. As a result, we're not inviting feedback on the online tool. It's purely a facility to enable the measures mapping and the local habitat map layers to be viewed. But we will be, as we do develop the sort of the final published tool, we will be going out to potential users to try and understand what you would be looking for in that online tool to make it as user friendly, and to ensure it has all the functionality that you would look for, obviously within the confines of our available resources. So just to give you an introduction to the tool itself, when you first launch the mapping tool, you will get the pop-up as shown, and you just simply need to read through the notes and then click the OK arrow. The tool does have a huge amount of layers of data available, and because you're able to view that in detail, it does mean that some of the layers may take some time to view. And depending on internet speeds and computer specifications, that could be up to 2 minutes, although in most cases it shouldn't be. But so please do be patient as it loads. And consequently, if it does stretch over 2 minutes, then it might be that it has frozen, so refresh the page. But because it can take a little while to load up, I'm afraid the presentation today is taking screenshots as opposed to a live action, because I didn't want to risk the chance of things stalling and us being frozen on a page. So once you've clicked OK on the welcome page, you'll get the map interface as shown here. And you can select your maps by clicking on the layers menu as indicated there on the right hand side. And that will draw down the various mapping functions that we have available. So first of all, you are able to select your preferred baseline map. So you can have street map, which is what's currently being shown, grayscale, or use a satellite map, and the street map is the default view. You can also have the option to select some features, which includes district boundaries, labels for those district boundaries, and also the rivers network. And again, the default is for all of those to be on, and you can just click them off if you don't wish to see them. You can find full details of all the mapped potential measures by clicking on the mapping table to the left of the screen. So when you click on the drop-down boxes for the various habitats, you will just have the reference number for the potential measure. So by clicking on that table, that will allow you to find the details of the potential measures you're looking at, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail shortly. And then also another functionality that you may find useful is the ability to zoom in and out, which you can do by pressing the plus and minus buttons again to the left-hand side of the screen. So as I've said, the potential measures are only included as reference numbers on the mapping layers. That's simply because the majority of our measures are quite long, and it would just make that that sort of layer menu very unwieldy. But if at any point you want to know what a potential measure reference relates to, you simply just click on that table button and it will bring up the measures table as shown. And then you just enter the reference number into the search box under the potential measures reference, and this will bring up what the measure is, whether it was used to inform the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, and a brief description of the mapping method and the data sources that can be used, and the data sources that it was based on. We provide much more detail on the mapping methodology and the data sources in the strategy appendices. So the first purpose of the strategy is to direct action for nature. So it proposes action that is required for the recovery of nature in Kent and Medway, and maps where those potential measures could be delivered. In some instances, those are wide-ranging areas, and in others, they are specific areas depending on the mapping capability. But in all cases, the mapping areas are indicative. Some mapping measures, or some management measures to increase the functionality or the biodiversity of a habitat have been mapped. Some have not. But mapping of that management indicates where it's most needed or would result in the greatest gains. But where it needs to be remembered that the introduction of appropriate management anywhere, as long as it's, as I said, appropriate management, so right management in the right place, that will deliver benefits wherever it is applied. So even if you've got an area of habitat and that particular management measure isn't shown on that particular spot, that does not mean that that management should not be introduced there. It just means that it has not been identified as an area where that management is particularly required or would result in particular benefits. Further, the strategic nature of this document means that some measures may not be relevant or appropriate when considered in detail at the very local level. So it's really important that any consideration of that measure is taken on known site conditions. So site assessments and other permissions and prerequisites are still required to inform the appropriateness of the action. So again, it's about remembering that this is a proposed measure for that area, as opposed to this action is absolutely the right action for this area. Also, it should be noted that a potential measure might have value locally, that when considered strategically at a county scale, that value is not there. So an exclusion from the mapping does not indicate that that action would not have a local value. It just is not valuable when considered at a county strategic scale. So there's quite a lot of nuances to the mapping that need to be considered when looking at them. And as I've said, the strategy and associated maps do not dictate actions or instruct their implementation. They are simply a guide for how the landowner and manager could use or manage the land or approach their operations in a way that could support the recovery of nature. So looking at how you might use the map to determine where delivery of a potential measure has been mapped for a specific habitat type, you might already know the particular measure or priority reference because you've been reviewing the strategy document and you've made a note of it for that. But alternatively, you might be just interested in seeing where measures for a particular habitat have been determined. So you can search for that within the map. You don't need to go through and read the whole strategy to find out which are the relevant ones. So the first thing to do is you pull up the table by clicking the table icon on the left-hand side, and then you stick in the measures search box at the top the particular habitat you're interested in. So in this case, I've popped in grazing marsh. That will then bring up all the potential measures that relate to that habitat. And what you need to do is note the reference number or numbers of any of the measures you want to view the maps for. So just note those down and then go on to the online map. So from the layers, you will check the box of the measure you wish to view. So in this case, we're having a look at GL 2.2, which is extending grazing marsh. You can select more than one measure at a time, but at the moment, the map will not distinguish between the potential measures. So you will only see the areas where both of those measures have been identified. So if you want to look at specifically where a measure is identified for, you need to look at them individually. And basically, once you've clicked on that, these blue areas will pop up. And these blue areas on the map indicate where opportunities for delivery of that measure have been identified to exist. And also, as I said, you can zoom in and out. Oops, pardon me. You can zoom in and out by clicking the plus or minus button, and it can really go down to quite a local level to see where those opportunities for that potential measure have been identified to exist. A second purpose of the strategy is to denote the areas of strategic significance. So this is sort of going to the point that Andy was asking to about the funding side of things. So a potential measure that falls within areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity indicates that that's an area of significance within the county. So if land falls in that area and the action aligns with the potential measures identified, this could be classed as strategically significant for any grant funding and investment scheme using that as an indicator for strategic significance. But exactly how that is going to work by government and other funding and investment bodies is not yet known. That will be down to the individual grants, etc., to determine that. But that's how we envisage it would work, is that if your potential measure or sort of the project you're doing aligns to the potential measure and is within an area of strategic significance, then that, as we understand it, would be looked favourably as a project proposal. But the one area we do have a better understanding on is the use of strategic significance in informing biodiversity net gain. So biodiversity net gain is a mandatory requirement that aims to make sure that development has a measurably positive impact on biodiversity. And that gain is calculated through the use of a standardized metric, which identifies the value of the land loss and the value of the biodiversity gained. And within that metric, there is a strategic significance multiplier, and that multiplier relates to the local habitat map of the local nature recovery strategy and the potential measures that fall within it. So obviously, biodiversity net gain will be much more meaningful if what we are delivering, or what is being delivered in terms of gains as biodiversity net gain requirements, is not just a gain for a gain's sake, but is also situated in areas of greatest need and is delivering actions that are most required. So therefore, high strategic significance will be applied when the habitat parcel in question is located in an area proposed to help deliver the local nature recovery strategy priority, and the intervention proposed is consistent with the potential measures identified also for that location. It's important to note that areas that could become of importance for biodiversity do not indicate areas where development should be excluded. They also do not dictate action nor place limitation on actions that will take place on that land. And in the absence of guidance on the role of local nature recovery strategies in local plan making, it's not expected that local plans and policies will be revised in reference to the strategy. However, planning authorities will need to have regard to and take account of our strategy in the application of their local plans and within planning decisions. In time, as local plans are revised and updated, the local habitat map and its areas of strategic significance will be really important and statutory source of spatial information that will be used to inform land use planning and ensure that nature and opportunities for its recovery are properly considered. But for the time being, as we understand it, there will be no retrospective application of the strategy to that. So in order to view the areas of strategic significance, you first need to click on the box that indicates the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, and also click on the areas of particular importance for biodiversity. So the opportunity areas, the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, will show in yellow, and the areas of particular importance, existing areas, will show in green. And the green and yellow areas that are shown on this map are effectively the local habitat map for Kent and Medway, and anything that is shaded denotes an area of strategic significance. So if you want to view whether a potential measure you're interested in is within an area of strategic significance, you firstly will select the measure you want to view. So we're going back to our Raising Marsh Restoration and Creation. And then you click both the boxes of areas that could become of importance to biodiversity and areas that are of importance to biodiversity. This will then create a map that is shown online here. And effectively, any area shaded in dark green or dark orange shows where a potential measure falls within the area that could become of importance for biodiversity, or area of particular importance for biodiversity, and therefore is in an area of strategic significance. So basically anything in dark green or orange is in an area of strategic significance because it is within the local habitat map. If the area remains blue, as shown here, it's not in an area of strategic significance. And the green and yellow areas of that are shown on the map, they're the areas of the local habitat map where that potential measure is not identified for. So essentially, the things you're really interested in are the dark green and the orange areas, because that shows where that particular potential measure does fall within an area of strategic significance. If you want to just view whether the potential measure is either within the areas of particular importance for biodiversity or areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, you can just simply select either one or the other layer, and that will show it. So again, you will then see for the APIB, it will be areas of dark green, shows where that measure falls. And if you're just selecting the ASIB, it's areas of orange, shows where that particular measure falls within that area. Once the strategy is published, the planning authorities will be required to take account of the local nature recovery strategy in the preparation of not just local plans, but also minerals and waste plans, and also neighbourhood plans will be required to take account of it. And this is a really important role for the strategy because it does ensure that nature and opportunities for its recovery are considered within future land use plans for the county. As I've said, many of the county's planning authorities already have plans in place, either revised or adopted plans, or they're well in advance of their process of plan revision. And in the absence of that guidance from MHCLG, it's not expected that there will be any retrospective application or any superseding of land use decisions already taken, and that includes allocated sites. And, you know, as I've said, the strategy is not designed as a tool to prevent development, nor do the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity preclude development. But instead, what it will do is inform local plans, and through its role in biodiversity net gain, guide development to maximise positive outcomes for nature in their development obligations for biodiversity. In some locations, more than one potential measure has been identified, and we have retained that in the mapping because it ensures that no opportunity for nature recovery is missed, and that that our broad areas for the county consider a range of habitats that creates that mosaic of habitats that we know nature recovery needs. Further work will be undertaken between now and our publication stage to look at how we can actually provide a better steer on the priorities for the published strategy, where more than one exists at a location. And essentially, these will be based on the application of the strategy principles. So we would first look to ensure that appropriate management is in place, and that would be the priority. Then once we have management in place, we would look to build on what is there by extending and buffering. But where there is not the opportunity to extend, they'll be looking for measures, prioritising measures that establish new. And then in terms of that final join-up principle, we envisage that that principle will be achieved by delivering on the first three principles and focusing that action within those areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, because we have designed our areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity on that connectivity needs for the county. We're also looking at how we can give consideration in respect to prioritising measures to deliver against the strategy's identified priorities. So just a final note in terms of protecting nature, obviously, my personal feelings aside, we should be doing everything we can to protect nature, but that is not the purpose of the strategy. The strategy provides a framework for nature recovery and directs action to where it's most needed and where it will deliver those greatest gains. And consequently, it does not offer any formal or otherwise protection, which can only be provided through statutory designations or local planning policy. So how government will choose to use the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity to inform their 30 by 30 remains to be seen. And likewise, local authorities may choose to use the strategy to help identify land that could be set aside for the purposes of nature recovery, but there is no requirement on them to do so. But it obviously does provide a strong evidence base and a useful source of information should they wish to do that. And therefore, no element of the mapping that is presented as part of the strategy should be viewed as some level of protection or some form of prevention for activities. So that concludes the overview and concludes this presentation. But before I finish, I'd like to just use this quote from the wonderful Sir David to remind us of why such a strategy and the ownership and delivery of it together is so important, because that partnership collaborative working is how we will recover nature in the county. And therefore, it's really important we hear your views on the strategy so we can ensure that it is something that you not only endorse, but feel you will be able to adopt in the delivery of your action for nature recovery. So I'll conclude there and open up the last few minutes for any further questions that you may have.
Got one on Slido already, which is from Mike Phillips, Liz, which is, will the ASIP mapping layer be simplified? Because there's some very small polygons in the layer that have probably been automatically generated.
We will be looking at refinement of it, but that's something, Mike, that we need guidance on as well, because one of the things you'll recall that I said what the LNRS will and won't do is it will and won't draw definitive boundaries, but obviously any mapping by its very nature draws localized definitive boundaries. So we need to understand how that will all be applied in the actual practice of using the maps, for instance, biodiversity net gain, strategic significance and other items, because there is obviously a potential advantage or disadvantage to being either in or out of the areas of strategic significance. And if you're looking at a piece of land that is right on the boundary of that, the question is whether there is any opportunity for anyone in whatever situation to justify whether that land should be or shouldn't be in a strategic significance. So it's something that we're waiting to understand, how that sort of non-localized, non-definitive boundary of the mapping that we were led to believe we were producing actually works in practice. So that's, again, I feel like a lot of these questions we're getting are ones that we need answers for from sort of DEFRA, and any questions we're not able to answer, we are taking away and asking that question to our advisors. I don't know, Mike, whether that's given you enough.
No, that is exactly the issue.
Yeah.
In terms of, you might be looking at a piece of land and a tiny sliver of it is ACIB, then it doesn't really make sense when you find when you sort of hone down at a real local level.
Yeah, exactly.
Got two more.
Yep.
Does the map and potential measures within the ASIB apply to strategic significance of baseline habitats or just proposed habitats for recreation enhancement?
Right, bear with me, I'm just going to, because that was quite a long one, I'm just going to look at that online so I get the actual does the map and potential measures. So yes, so it applies to the baseline habitats. Yes. So because it depends where you're using a strategic significance in the process. So if you're looking at the habitat impacted, then it's applying. But if you're looking at the strategic significance in terms of delivery, if we're talking about biodiversity net gain, then it applies to effectively the habitats proposed for creation or enhancement. So you have to delve down into the detail of that potential measure for that particular location, and if the potential measure relates to the habitat that you're either losing or it relates to the habitat you're creating, and also the intervention is in line, then that's when the strategic significance applies. Hopefully that makes sense. I think this is sort of following on a bit from Mike's query as well, is that we're yet to really see the application of the local habitat map strategic significance in practice and understand the potential issues and nuances that come along with using it as a map. There's only a couple of local nature recovery strategies that are published or in practice, so I think it's something that we will need to look at in time.
Only one other question, which is, will landowners be able to look up their land holdings, for example, with a polygon search?
So not on the current tool. On the current tool, it'd be a case of looking for your land by just scanning in. And then, like I say, so if you know what things you would like to do on your land, so the way in which you do it, you would first of all use the table to look up the different measures that you think would be applicable to your land by either searching. So within the potential measure search box, you can put in any keyword. So as well as putting in the habitat type, if there are certain things that you want to do, like create or extend or those sorts of things, you can put those words in as well, and that will help you search for the measures that relate either to the action or to the habitat. So then you would make a note of those measures, then you would scan down to where your land is using the plus and minus, turn your switch on the relevant potential measures you're interested in, and then if you want to know if it fits in strategic significance, then also turn on the ASIB and APIB layers, and that will bring it all up. Our hope is to have the tool that we publish is something where you can just literally click on the parcel land and it comes up and tells you everything you need to know about a bit of land. So whether it sits within the ASIB, whether it has a potential measure identified for it. Of course, that's what we hope to be able to develop. What we can actually do in practice, and again, like I say, with available budgets, remains to be seen. But we're going to be working in the background on that between now and July, to have something that really is, has really good functionality. Because the easier it is for someone to look at that tool and use that tool, the more likely it is that we will see those potential measures occurring, because they're able to access the detail they need. Any other questions, Chris?
No further questions. Lots of people thanking you for a good overview, and that's it. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you everyone for attending this morning. I do hope it has been useful. No doubt, as you delve into the consultation draft, there will be further questions you may have. Please, in the first instance, check our website, because we will constantly be updating our FAQs under the public consultation section of the website, and hopefully you will find the answer there. If you don't, please get in contact with us via the Making Space for Nature email address, and we will do our best to answer it, and we will continue to update the FAQs. So anything you send in, will end up going onto that FAQs for the next person who comes up with it. And we really look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback on the strategy.